something over 10 years ago that we were at a very local, we live in Interlake and down in the Finger Lakes, between Seneca and Cuba Lake, and we were at a very local estate sale, and I was ready to leave. We had picked out a few things, and she's still pawing through textiles, and she found two wonderful whole cloth quilts that dated late 1700s, early 1800s, and then this fragment of a coverlet, which we brought home and didn't know anything about it, and that's where we got started in learning more about coverlets. So we're pretty involved at this point. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what we mean by a coverlet at this point, so that we're all on the same page on that, and then talk more specifically about what perhaps little we know about weavers in Orleans County at this point. And I'll be happy to entertain questions as we go along, so if something comes up and you want clarification, I might be able to answer that. So the photos in here, either from our personal collection or from the museum's collection, unless there is a separate citation on where the image came from. So what is it? What is a coverlet? And the simplest is it's a woven bed cover. So distinguishing it from quilts, which are usually pieced fabric and 2 layers, often with batting in between, that are either stitched together or tied. So distinguishing that from a coverlet, which is actually woven. And then lower right, blankets are more similar to coverlets in that they're woven, but they don't have some of the features that we typically expect to find in a coverlet. And one example is that usually there is a border on a coverlet where blankets typically don't. But I'm going to make some generalizations. There's always exceptions to every one of those. So usually there is a center field pattern with a border on 3 sides. That's the most typical. And but occasionally there's border on all 4 sides. And some of the simpler coverlets might not even have a border on them. And there is usually 2 corner blocks. So where the 2 borders come together, like in the upper right-hand corner, I'll show you better images later. Where those 2 borders intersect, then there is usually a corner block. And on the lower right, you can see, or lower left rather, you can see there's a corner block like this on each of those. So there's usually a center field, border, and corner blocks. Again, there are exceptions. So here you can see up close a little bit better. The one on the left, I'll get into that more, we refer to that as a geometric pattern. And there you can see there is a distinct corner block, but there's no text or anything in it. It's just the intersection essentially of those patterns. I should have asked, is anybody a weaver in the group here? I have to be careful what I say.
You say?
And then you see on the right, the corner block actually has text in it. So when the weavers had the capability of doing the figuring rather than just a geometric, they would need an extra loom attachment to be able to do that level of detail, to get figuring like that in their coverlets. And it was usually the professional weavers who were weaving to make some or all of their living, that could afford to have that special loom attachment. And one of the, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but one of the more common loom attachments is referred to as jacquard, which was actually it was developed by a Frenchman by the name of Jacquard for the silk industry. And the interesting thing about it, it controls the loom through the use of punch cards. So it essentially is the predecessor to our computers. But once they had that capability, they could also weave text, not just figuring like this. And so that's where you see the corner block with text in it sometimes. So that corner block would, the most common things, there might be some combination of a date, a weaver's name, a client's name, who it was custom made for, or a place name. So some combination of that was typically what would be in there. Let's see, I think that's what I wanted to cover there. So typically the coverlets are woven in 2 panels, which are then stitched together to make the full width of the cover of bed. So you can see there where the 2 panels on that coverlet were stitched together and they didn't quite match up the pattern. Sometimes they do a good job of matching it up, sometimes not so good. But there you can see the example of that it was 2 panels. So they would actually weave it in one long strip, and then essentially they would be weaving their pattern and then essentially shifting it in reverse and going the other way, so that when they separated that into 2 parts and brought it around, then they could match up that pattern in the center. And so this is an example from the National Museum of the American Coverlet in Bedford, PA, where they actually have in their collection one of those that was never separated. It's still in one big strip. So right at the top center is where it would have been separated. So what's wrong with this coverlet?
Panels aren't in the corner.
No border.
They separated it and they put the borders together in the middle instead of the other way around, so the borders would be on the outside. See, the corner blocks are actually in the center. So some people say that these coverlets would have been regularly taken apart to clean because they would be so big and heavy if they were wet. By the way, I don't recommend anybody washing these coverlets these days, especially not in the washing machine. So they would suggest, some people have suggested they take them apart to clean them periodically and then they would stitch them back together. There's also, it's unclear that when a weaver completed one, whether he gave those 2 separate panels to the customer and the customer stitched them together, or whether they stitched them together before they gave it to the client. My inclination is that the weaver probably stitched that together themselves and then gave it to the customer.
Marty?
Yeah.
Quick question, is the stitching difficult? I've heard that it wasn't the easiest thing to do if you want to get it right.
Well, Mary Jean could probably say more about the stitch types, but if you were skilled at it, you could actually do some correction if those patterns didn't quite match up right. You could sort of squeeze the one side together a little bit to try to get them matched up all the way through. So I think it would be a skilled person who, well, actually, those days, most everybody was skilled in the textiles and of sewing. I don't know, I think there are a couple of different types of stitches that I think people used. In some cases they were actually butted together like that very cleanly, and so they basically, you'd see the same thing on both sides in terms of what that seam looked like. And sometimes they'd sort of roll them, and then you'd see the 2 edges together on the one side. On the top side, it would be nice and even. I don't know, is there a name for those 2 different ways of approaching that?
It's basically a whip stitch.
A whip stitch that you would use?
That's
Okay.
what I was gonna say.
Okay. So fiber-wise, they're usually wool and cotton. And the cotton is usually the light color that wasn't dyed, and anything that is dyed is typically the wool. Now, it's not 100%, but cotton doesn't take dyes very well. Occasionally we'll come across one where the cotton in it is dyed, but it's usually the light or white or natural color is cotton, and the whatever the colors are is typically wool. So one of the questions I had early on was, we raise sheep and have wool around here. We don't grow cotton around here. How in the 1830s and 40s were they finding the cotton? But it turns out that there was cotton here very, very early that was being shipped in from even, from India, but also the Caribbean, and to a certain extent, southern part of the U.S. So there were cotton mills in Ithaca, I think, as early as the 1820s, where they were bringing in bales of cotton and then processing it locally. But if you look at advertisements from that time period in, say, newspapers, you will see that they sometimes list the yarns that they have, and that is the cotton thread and the cotton yarns that were available at the time. It wasn't uncommon at all for the local family that was contracting with a weaver to provide the wool. But the advertisements sometimes from the time period would actually give specifications on how that wool should be spun, what weight and how much in order to complete a coverlet. Sometimes the weavers were also dyers, but sometimes they were also dyed, the wool would have been dyed at home and then brought to the weaver to do.
Did they ever use linen?
Good question. I was gonna mention that and I forgot. Linen was, we could grow the flax, and it was grown quite widely in the Northeast, and yes, indeed, they were using linen, but in coverlets we don't see it very often. They're mostly cotton, but in the case of using linen, at least it's something that could have been produced at home and then woven. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So they often also had fringes. New York, it's a lot more common than some of the other regions. New York and even New England, you don't see fringes quite as much. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, you see it much more common. You can see this one has remnants of a fringe. This one has remnants of a fringe. Fringes come in a lot of different, very simple ways of doing it, and sometimes very complex, like you see there. And the fringes would have typically been on 1 or 3 sides. And those fringes, like these, were actually what we call self-fringed. They're actually part of the warp threads that are making up the fringe. But in the case of, like this one here, I can't tell for sure, but the fringe might have been made separately and then added to it. And sometimes they might have a self fringe on the bottom and an added fringe on the 2 sides. So I want to distinguish between geometric and figured and fancy. So these are 2 basic patterns. Excuse me. So on the left you see an example of the geometric pattern. On the right is an example of the figured and fancy, or just figured patterns. I already mentioned something about how the figured patterns were possible if you had an appropriate loom attachment, and the jacquard loom attachment wasn't the only one that was out there. Another one that we read about, but there's apparently no extant example of, is referred to as a barrel loom or a cylinder loom, and it was basically a barrel or a cylinder that had pegs in it, very similar to a music box cylinder. So those pegs were what would control which of the individual threads would have been lifted and which ones would have been held down every time you throw the shuttle back and forth to create the pattern when weaving. And
Was that wooden, did you say?
They would have been mostly wooden, as far as I know. They might have had a metal too, but the way I understand it is those pegs, it was done in a way that the pegs could be adjusted, so that you could change the pattern. And I've seen pictures, but everybody I've talked to, there's no known example. They were also used in Europe, but there were also patents here in the U.S. for improvements on some of those kinds of things before the jacquard type loom attachment became most common with the punch card use of controlling that. We'll get into this a little bit more, but here, for example, you can pass these around, these are for handling. These two are geometric patterns, and there's a particular weave structure that, so here we see a bunch of different geometric patterns and different colors. And one of the types of weave structure, which is what you see right here, is called overshot or float work. And if you look at it closely, you can see that the weft thread, that's the one that goes back and forth, actually goes over multiple work threads before it comes down, and that's where it gets the name of overshot or float work. And so that type could have easily been woven in a home where they would have had a 4-shaft loom, so you didn't need any more complex equipment than what you would have been using to weave rag rugs or the basic textiles that might have been used for towels or bed sheeting, things like that. But you could make a pattern similar to that with just a four harness or 4-shaft loom. So there you can, this is pictures that just give an example as well. You can see the corner block on that. Now there are other geometric patterns, and this is called a double weave. And this one, in order to do this, you actually needed you need many more than just 4 of the shafts that lift the work threads up and down. Because it's actually 2 layers of fabric. And if you can see it here, this is a tattered piece we just bought, in fact, for this purpose. But let me see if I can find a place. But so here you can see the solid blue, and then the opposite side it's actually got 2 colors. And those 2 pieces can actually be separated, so it's actually 2 layers. That's why they call it double cloth or double weave in the weave structure. So the opposite sides are the exact same pattern, but it's essentially reversed in the coloration. And you're welcome to take a look at that, and you can try pulling parts apart where you see that there's a fair amount of one color. You can pull on both sides and get a sense of that. Maybe that one I should cut up so they can pass more at once. Pardon me?
Was it warmer?
It would be warmer, yes, indeed, and heavier. It's quite a bit more material, and so it would take more wool to do it. You know what? I didn't even look at this one very closely. I don't know, maybe Mary Jean, you could look at it. Well, I was wondering if maybe this was actually wool as well, but I think it's cotton, the white color. Sometimes they're all wool, but that's not very common. So this weave structure is referred to as double weave. There are a lot of different geometric patterns that can happen. Now I'm getting ahead of my story, but this is also a double weave, but that's the double weave is the weave structure, but this is a pattern that is figured where that is a pattern that's geometric.
Is the double weave a lot harder to do?
It would take more equipment, and it would be a more skilled, weaver to in order to do it. Yeah. And sometimes the old advertisements, they would just call them double coverlets. And when I first saw that, I was like, well, double bed size or something, but it's usually referring to the weave structure. So here's another, so this is also geometric, and the pattern is very similar to that double weave, but the weave structure is different. And I don't know how to explain it other than it just looks sort of blurry or something, you know? You don't get that crisp white against the crisp blue in that. And this is actually an example of that weave structure, and it's referred to as summer-winter. And summer-winter is, in the weaving circles, is actually a weave structure. Some people use it generically for any coverlet or blanket that is light predominantly on one side and dark predominantly on the other side, and that's a misuse of that phrase. So even like here, it's predominantly light color on one side and predominantly dark color on the other side, but that's not summer-winter. This is summer-winter because of the weave structure. I mean, this also would be somewhat contrasty like that, but you can see how it's just sort of not crystal sharp where the pattern shifts from light to dark. And there you can see two patterns that are very similar, but their weave structures. One on the left is the double weave, and the one on the right is the summer-winter. And I don't think there are any in the collection that are summer-winter weave structure, which is why I brought this one along, just to show you what that looks like. But it is also in Orleans County, so somebody here was doing that. So I mentioned that in the geometric patterns, they were basically just doing simple, sometimes complex, but geometric patterns. Occasionally they actually got to the point where they could do some imagery. And so this is one example of that, where it looks like a cathedral structure in the border. But that's very, very uncommon, where they basically doing a geometric double weave, but it's got sort of an imagery of something recognizable other than geometric shapes. So now we get into the figured and fancy, and so there's an example of a double weave. There's plenty of them upstairs that are double weave, that are figured and fancy. I brought this one along because this one is from Kendall Mills, and that wasn't represented in the collection here. We had one in our personal collection, so I wanted to show that. So this is a double weave, but it's figured and fancy. This one reads, wove by J. Shearman, Kendall Mills, 4E Balcom, 1847. So in that particular case, this was, you can see in the lower part of the corner block, the upper part would be the client's name. You know, one thing I didn't mention is virtually all of the figured coverlet weavers, or the professional weavers, were men. There's one documented, and there are a couple of others that we're still trying to document, where women were professional weavers of fancy coverlets like this. And because this was their profession, the women were typically not involved. Now, the one example that we do have was a Latrette, Sarah Latrette, whose father and brother were also weavers, and when father died, the daughter actually took over and wove for quite a few years. And this happens to be, the woven for Mary Lacherette, and this was Tyrone, which is now Schuyler County, New York, and during the time of the 1830s, it was part of Steuben County. But in the lower, you see the initials HL, and that was Henry Lacherette, who was the weaver. And I haven't figured out who Mary was in relation to Henry, but Henry Lacherette was a weaver in Schuyler County.
So did the weaver change the pegs to make their own design?
Yeah,
And
they
I
would
find
either
them
the
so
peg,
intricate, I can't believe it.
yeah, it's pretty amazing. And either the pegs or the punch cards, depending on what devices they were using in order to do that. Yeah.
They picked their
Well,
own
it's a really good point. Some did and some didn't. You could also acquire patterns. So you could acquire a set of punch cards to put on your jacquard loom attachment, where there was a professional pattern maker might have made them and then sold them. We're still trying to learn more about that. The other thing is that I mentioned there were some loom attachments to make improvements on weaving figured fabric, and sometimes what they would do is there would be, they would license the use of that pattern for a certain geographic area. And sometimes the pattern, or at least several patterns, would come with that licensing of that pattern. So you see patterns repeated, like even the similarity between this and that. I mean, look at you got the lily, you got that little thing in the middle here. I mean, there's a lot of similarity, even this part right there where it comes down to the edge of the border. The border pattern is quite different. So I think it varied depending on the skill of the weaver, on whether he would be developing his own patterns or he'd be primarily working with another. But they would have had to have some knowledge of that in order to change the text in the corner.
Did they have names for some of these patterns?
There have been, yes, there would have been. We found some references to that in some of the advertisements of the time period, and there's several weaver account books that have been found, and sometimes they would mention the pattern. But there are also, just over time, people have assigned, like I think, Mary Jean, is this like Lilies of France or something? I think this is called. Sometimes there's a 4 rows pattern. Can't really see it the way I got it up there, but this is actually a group of 4 like this, just like that's a group of 4. So 4 roses, sometimes I think it's referred to as 2 roses, because when they were weaving it, this is essentially a repeat of this.
Have you ever found accounting as to what the weavers got paid?
Yeah, not much, but, I mean, I've forgotten. I should.
I mean, was it something the privileged could afford? Was it
More
that
so,
thing?
or middle and upper, more so, if it was going to be figured like this. It would have been just a few dollars though in the 1830s, but that could have been a lot of money.
Yeah.
I heard a story from an older relative that she had 2 coverlets, and they'd come down from her husband's grandparents. And the girls had taken their own wool over to Seneca Falls and had them woven over there, and the price was $3. But if you wanted your name in the corner, it was another $1.
Yeah,
Is that right?
that sounds about right. Yep. And there are a couple of account books. There's account books at the Coverlet Museum in Palmyra, which I haven't spent any time with, but there it would give the client's name on who was buying it and maybe something about the pattern and what they paid for it. And sometimes advertisements will even specify some of that. So digitized newspapers are a great way to find some of this information. Go ahead.
Did the weavers travel to different places and drum up business and then go back and do it and then deliver it?
Not usually.
Not usually.
We often hear about the itinerant weaver, and I don't think there are many examples of that. Most of them that I'm familiar with, though I'm going to show you some exceptions here later, the weaver is weaving locally and is putting the place name of where he weaves and where his client lives. That's typically what it is. And the licensing of the patents that I mentioned before often had a geographic distinct place where they were allowed to weave for the customers in that area. It might be just a single town.
Is that part of a guild or something?
No, not usually, not that I've come across that there were guilds, though there were extended families that were involved. I mentioned Henry Lacheret. His brother David Lacheret also wove in Schuyler County, and even a little bit in Tompkins County. And his brother, John Lacheret, was the patriarch who went to Indiana and wove, where his daughter then Sarah took over that business. But their grandparents, and maybe even one generation beyond that, were weavers of something. So they had a long line of weavers. But there was also a family of weavers in Groton, New York, which is Tompkins County, by the name of Conger. And Jonathan Conger and George Dietrich patented a loom attachment to improve figured weaving in, I want to say 1831, don't remember for sure. And a fellow researcher has put together, there must be half a dozen or more who were either married into that family or were related in some way, other siblings of Jonathan Conger. And they ended up just sort of spreading out and weaving in different places, but there was like this extended family where they used to sort of spread out their weaving empire. I haven't come across anything that suggested a guild that I remember. That was certainly a big deal in Europe. So here's a figured and fancy that is a different weave structure. So the pattern is figured, but the weave structure is called tied bidawand. There's a couple of different names for that, but that's what we've typically called it. And do we have? Oh, it's hidden back here. This is actually not. This is a true bidawand, but this is what you're looking for on the bidawand. But you can see these vertical lines in the weave structure. And it basically, in this case, it looks like two warp threads, and then there is a blue, much finer warp thread that pulls everything down, so it gives this lined look in here. And this, on the tied bidawand, that would look the same on both sides. In this case, it's what we know as true bidawand, because the other side isn't got that same kind of striping in it. So it's a German weave structure. That's about all I can tell you about it. But this one is true. But if you look at this side, it's the way the tied bidawand. So here you can see the lines here. You can't see it so well unless you get up close here. But those lines show up on both sides. So this was, that one was woven for Elizabeth Reynolds, and it was woven by J.M. Davidson, a fancy weaver in Lodi in Seneca County, which is where we live. But there are also multiple examples of that in the, you'll see it in the catalog, the exhibit catalog, but also on display of that particular weave structure. So this is an example of what I just said, which is more similar to that. True bidawand, so you get the vertical lines on the one side, on the reverse side you get there's the solid contrasty imagery. This one is attributed to Harry Tyler, who wove primarily in Jefferson County, New York. He was very, very prolific. But as you'll see later, he actually wove in western New York as well for a while. This one, the name I tracked down to Niagara County, Lucinda France. Sometimes when you have unique names like that for the client, you have a better chance of figuring out where they live instead of Mary Smith or something like that, and how you figure it out. The other thing is most of these, I shouldn't say most, yeah, probably most of these were woven for young women. And so it might have been, you know, just before or when they got to be marriage age or something like that. So then it also creates the problem of doing the research of figuring out, was this their maiden name or is this their married name? And so doing the research that way.
I think that's one of the interesting things about our collection here is one of the coverlets has a man's name, Orson Towsley.
Yep. It's quite uncommon, but yes, you do see it. Yep. Sometimes people would have, you know, the family might have ordered a coverlet for just about everybody in their family or something like that. Yeah.
Now, could that man be the weaver though?
No.
It
We know
could
who
be, but
we know who he was.
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible, and sometimes takes a little bit of work to try to figure out whether that is the weaver's name or the client's name. But you're usually safe in saying if it's a woman's name, that it's not the weaver's name, but it's the client's name that's on the cover.
If these are made of wool, why aren't they full of moths?
People cared for them. We find lots of them that have been full of moths. Yeah, I mean, people, they were family heirlooms. I mean, they were important. They weren't just, you know, the blanket that you threw on the bed and later used as a horse blanket. They tried to take care of them because they were special. They're vulnerable to moths now. I'm always concerned about that. So whenever we acquire a new one, we put it in the freezer for several weeks to try to kill any living critters that might be in there. So quick summary, it's a woven bed cover. Usually there's a center field with border on 3 sides, corner blocks usually in 2 corners, often 2 panels stitched together in the center. Sometimes there's a fringe, usually they're wool and cotton. They're geometric pattern and figured in fancy patterns. There are several different weave structures. 2 colors is most common, but sometimes there's more, as you saw, than just 2 colors. In New York, the most common is blue and white. Less common is red and white. It's pretty uncommon to see 3 colors in New York coverlets. We've come across a couple, we see it occasionally. They're very common in Pennsylvania and Ohio coverlets to see more than 2 colors. So the peak period for coverlets like this was the 1830s through the 1850s. So there were coverlets earlier than that, and there were coverlets after that, but that's sort of the peak period. By the time the Civil War came along and industrialization, these handcrafted coverlets became less common, and there were still coverlets being made, but they would have been more made probably in a mill where they were special. They weren't creating any special ones like even putting a date or a name on it.
Have you traveled all over like over England way and all those countries for coverlets, or just in the States?
Just in the States.
Just in the States?
Yeah, I may have acquired one that was American from a European seller at some point, but no, and I think there's still, some people are more knowledgeable about sort of the connections between the weaving traditions in Europe and what happened here that made these basically typical American. But there were a lot of weavers from the British Isles, so England and Scotland in particular. There was a big textile industry. It became more industrialized sooner than it did here. So they were without a job. They sometimes came here because we weren't as industrialized. They could still weave, practice their trade. I would say that a higher percentage of the weavers that were working in New York were of that tradition, whereas the higher percentage of the weavers in Pennsylvania were Germanic, which makes sense because the settlement there was more Germanic. And you can see differences in those.
Why is the difference in color? Is it conservative New England, New York, the blue and white? Or is it the Pennsylvania Dutch with the many colors?
You know, I'm not sure of the why on that. It might have, sorry, some of it may have to do, a lot of it probably had to do with the traditions. Some of it may have to do with availability of the dyes. Indigo is what was used for the blue. Red was typically the madder and cochineal. So madder is plant-based, red, and cochineal is actually made from an insect that gives the red. Those were actually pretty available. There were other natural dyes that people could acquire or make during the time period. I don't know why. I'm guessing that, like the second thing you said, that the multiple colors were just more typical of German tradition of colors. But I mean, you I'm sure recognize that the quilts that you see from Pennsylvania have certain colors with their oranges and their greens, which is less common to see that coming out of New York State. That's a guess, I don't know. So this may be hard for you to read back there, but the red place names in there are Western New York towns that have documented coverlets. So you can see they're really scattered around. I just have one for Orleans County because some of the, there are a bunch of them. I don't have a specific place name in some cases for those that are Orleans County, but there are a couple of place names, Eagle Harbor, Overton, and Kendall Mills in the county that are on specific coverlets. Niagara County, you can see there's Pekin, Cambria, Newfane, and some of them that just say Niagara County. Genesee County, same thing. Some of them say Genesee County, but some of them say Darien or Bethany. There was a Weaver in Caledonia, Wheatland. There's also, I didn't even put one on Riga. There's also coverlets that are marked Riga. And you get all the way down into Chautauqua County and Livingston County and Wyoming County. And then further east into the Finger Lakes, there are many more. So, and often they were in the smaller towns, which is interesting.
Do you document it by the weaver worked in that county or the person lived in that county?
All of the above.
All of the above.
In some cases, we don't know who the weaver was in some of these, but we have place names either woven like this Orleans County, but we're not sure who the weaver was. In some cases, we may have a client name and we're able to determine where they had lived, which would help us then determine where the weaver was working, because they usually wove pretty close to home.
How do you clean them?
For the most part, we don't. Unless there's something that we think is going to continue to degrade the coverlet, we tend to air them out sometimes because of odors, but we don't clean. There are professional textile conservators who clean them. Some people do wash their coverlets, like there's certain, the wrong word is detergent, but a cleaning agent that is particularly good for wool, and they'll do it in a bathtub, and they will put netting in first so that they can lift it with the netting and not with the textile itself, because it would be so heavy, and then just doing that multiple times. You haven't washed any coverlets, you washed some quilts, right? Yeah. So I basically discourage people from doing any of that at home.
How do you store yours?
We store ours by folding them and putting them in an old pillowcase and putting them on shelves.
Okay.
Ideally, they should be spread out and laid flat, so, having it on an unused bed, you can put a bunch of them on that way. And if you're storing them folded, you should periodically take them out and refold them,
Right.
which we're not very good at doing ourselves. And some museums in particular, store them on rolls.
Yeah.
So that you don't have the fold
And
crease.
the museums, a lot of times put them in those trays.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, if you have the space to
yeah,
open them up and put them on trays, that's great. Yep. We recently were at the Carl Coverlet Gallery in Pennsylvania, on the campus of St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And they have some of them stored on rolls and some of them in these great big trays that are coming out like drawers, which is great.
And so you said they took them apart to clean them back in the day. How would they clean them? Put them in a tub of water?
I
or-
think so, yeah, I think they would have put them in a tub of water and use something to wash them. My experience is, we've seen some that were washed and you find that the cotton is not laying nice and flat like this, it's sort of wrinkled up. And I think it's because they wash them, and when wool is in water, it acts different than cotton in water.
Right.
So they don't dry out the same, and so they end up with the cotton being wrinkly because the wool probably shrunk a little bit.
yeah.
So, yeah. So, getting closer to home, who wove coverlets in Orleans County? Well, generically, many unnamed women working in their homes wove coverlets. Those would have been like the overshots that we passed around there before. So they could have been woven at home, and probably some unnamed men in weave shops were weaving the geometrics as well. And the geometrics that were double weave, like that 3-color one that we passed around, those would have probably been done in either a professional weave shop or somebody who had a more sophisticated loom than was typically in the home. As far as the figures go, we've got the names of 3, possibly 4. So D.P. Johnson is the name that's on several of the coverlets upstairs. It says D.P. Johnson Weaver. It was only two years that name was on the coverlets, 1847 and 1848. J. Sherman or Shearman, that's the weaver's name here is J. Shearman. There was a J. Sherman who wove in Livingston County in Mount Morris and in a couple of other places down there. We know from advertisements, etc. And then we find these Kendall Mills with the name J. Shearman, and he's doing the weaving in a very similar manner. He's doing the corner block, what we would call upside down, compared to what they typically do, but he's spelling his name different. So we still have a lot of research to do to try to figure that out, but we think that's the same person. And then Harry Tyler, who was a weaver I mentioned in Jefferson County, very, very prolific, hundreds of coverlets known. And he is also known to have woven in Western New York at some point, and then his son, Almond Tyler, also wove after Harry Tyler died. Someday I'll get enough time to research. Harry Tyler also had a daughter, and I've talked to some researchers who are convinced that she was the one that continued the weaving business after Harry Tyler died, but we haven't been able to completely document that yet. So those are those that we are pretty sure were weaving here in Orleans County. So this is one of them that's on display upstairs. So these are some of the coverlets that are in this collection. So this is a geometric overshot. Notice that it has a fringe. This particular pattern is known as velvet rose. So the The overshot coverlets, there's a lot more research and documentation historically of the patterns, with pattern names. But there's a given pattern might have several different names, and a given name may represent several different patterns. So it's this whole sort of tradition of passing these things down, and so it's not like standardized in any way. This one is particularly interesting. It's an overshot, but it's 3 colors, not just the 2 colors. That's a little bit uncommon, but not totally unusual. But just really, really nice colors. And that is known as the 9 snowballs, which is this part right here, 9.
Yeah.
That's the part that's being referred to by that pattern. This one you think might have come out of the 1960s. It is known as double bow knot. It's really an interesting pattern. We've got 2 of them upstairs that are variations on that pattern.
Were the looms American made?
Most of them, but not all, but they usually had like a European tradition. So looms were often made once they got here. Often they were what we refer to as timber frame, sometimes known as barn frame, the heavy looms, and then the other parts, they were often made locally, but some people are experts on them and by sort of identifying the European traditions that the different styles of looms came from. We have 2 looms in our possession right now that somebody pointed out to me, knew I was interested in weaving in coverlets and stuff, and he said, hey, there's Facebook Marketplace, I think, or either that or Craigslist, said there's a couple of looms available and they're over in Groton. And I just mentioned that, Groton is where the Conger family was from and they had patent, and I thought, well, this is cool. So I contacted the guy, they were listed for free. And so I contacted the guy and we talked for a little bit and he said, well, what do you want them for? And I said, well, I'm not a weaver, but I'm very interested in textile history, and I would, see that they got to a weaver who was interested in that. And he says, great, they're yours. He says, everybody else who's contacted me wanted to use them for firewood.
Oh, wow.
So, we haven't found them a home yet. They're in storage right now, but we've talked to several people who are definitely
Is
interested.
there any thought that they might be Conger's looms?
Well, that was my original thought, but so far we haven't identified anything that would suggest that. Yeah, that would have been so cool if we could have somehow
Where
made
do they
that.
keep these looms? Up in a loft or in a barn?
You mean,
I mean, when
Where
they were
would-
weaving.
when they were weaving, they would often be in, like right in the living space, because at home at least, if it was the home loom, because the woman was not spending all day weaving. She would spend a few minutes weaving between taking care of the baby or fixing meals or going to the garden or whatever. So it would often be interrupted work that they would be doing, so it would be in their workspace somewhere. Some of the professional weavers actually put them in a loft or upstairs room, or Harry Tyler, the story is, he put it in his first floor, and he put a hole in his floor because that loom attachment needed to go above the loom, and it was so tall that he had to put that essentially up into the second floor. We visited a friend in Vermont who actually uses a jacquard style loom attachment, and he has it in his loft above his house because it's really tall. It sort of goes right up into the upper part.
They have them over at Genesee Country Museum too, don't they?
They have looms, but I haven't seen one over there that's a jacquard type, the card driven type of, do you remember, Mary Jean, was there one?
I don't think there was one.
There is an active or there's one that's set up that gets used in the Science Center in Toronto. It actually was, there was a weaver in Caledonia by the name of, trying to blank on his name. Anyhow, he moved to Ontario, and this was his loom that ended up in the Science Center in Ontario. I think there's one in like the Henry Ford Museum or something like that. There's a couple of others around.
You know, there's one down in Yates County in that museum.
They have a jacquard type or a
I'm
loom?
not sure,
Okay.
just probably a barn.
Yeah, yeah. There's a fair number of those around. There's some very active groups on Facebook too who are interested in these kinds of things.
And back to the guy that gave you those two looms, how did he happen to have them?
Oh, yeah, I didn't mention that part of the story. They were in his grandmother's attic as long as his grandmother could remember, and she was in her 80s. And she moved to a retirement facility and they had to empty the house. And I've seen pictures of the house and I don't think there would have been room in the attic to set it up. I think it was disassembled and in the attic for 80 years or something. And so when they had to empty it, he was a young man, probably in his mid-20s. He had an interest in history, and he wouldn't let them throw it out. And he was trying to figure out some place for it. Interesting sidebar. I asked him, are there any family stories? Are there any diaries? Are there any like weavers' account books or anything like that? And he said, my grandmother has a diary from early on, but I can't read it. I can't read cursive.
Oh my God.
Oh, I'm
You
experienced
can.
that.
Yeah, so, there's that generation where it hasn't been taught for quite a while. And so they're gonna struggle doing historical
They're
research.
bringing it back in California into the school.
So this is a double bow knot that's upstairs that is unusual in the sense that there was a part of plain weaving along the edge, and then I believe it's hand stitched in initials rather than actually woven in. But they made a space for putting in the initials and ownership on an overshot type. So there were a few coverlets that were overshot in nature where they actually did weave in initials and a date. And you can see it says PE 1827. There have been several of these, I don't know, I think there have been 40 or 50 documented that are something like this, and they range from 1771 up to 1840, I think, or 40s. And a few of them have been tracked back with the ownership, the provenance, and most of them have shown up as being tracked back to the broader Albany area, so eastern New York. So there were one or more weavers there that were capable of weaving in characters in an overshot geometric. So, but we don't see them very often. This one is in our collection. So there's another one that's upstairs. It's a double weave in 2 colors, where that one sample that I passed around was a double weave in 3 colors. And the carriage wheel is what that pattern is called. So this is another one in the collection, an example of a figured double weave. You can see the corner block I've made bigger there, the property of Nancy Wright, Orleans County, New York, 1846. So this imagery is quite common among the ones that we see upstairs in the exhibit. The 4 rows actually very similar to this. The border with the eagles and the weeping willows, you see that on a number of them as well. And I have not researched Nancy Wright, is that a family name that's common here, Wright, in the county?
There's some in Kendall that
Okay.
That family?
Fairly common name.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
West Kendall, actually.
West Kendall, okay. So here's another one that is pretty special, Eagle Harbor, so they're giving a specific location within Orleans County. There aren't too many of the ones that have Orleans County in the corner block that give a specific place name. Again, I haven't researched Sarah Louise at Tanner, but appears to be a local family. And there you see slight variation on the border pattern. You can see there are also the weeping willows. This is just half of it because the pattern repeats. Well, we refer to this as an apple tree. I don't know what they originally intended. And then the eagles with the shield. So here's two more Eagle Harbor that are in the McCarroll Coverlet Gallery. There you see one that's 3-color. I mentioned that that's very uncommon in New York, but there's an example. There's an AA and an AB. I don't know if there was an AC and an AD or if there were others, but these two happen to be in the collection at the McCarroll Coverlet Gallery. So here's a figured double weave. Again, this one is unique in the sense that it's got the additional place name of Hulberton, not just Orleans County. And that's in this collection. So now there's two that are figured, and they're the tied biter wand that are in the collection. So you can see some similarities in the patterns between those two, but they're different colors. I really like the Ann Dobbs color. When you get upstairs, you can take a look at that. It's not a bright red. It's almost like I don't know, a terracotta or something like that in color. It's really pretty cool. But these are that tied biter wand weave structure. But also notice what's unique here is that one is in 1847, the other one is in 1848, and now we've got D.P. Johnson Weaver in the corner block. Now I think that probably all of those from, I forget what the earliest was, 1834 or something like that, up until 1846, that were saying the property of in Orleans County in the corner block. I suspect it was the same weaver as was weaving here and putting his name, D.P. Johnson, on it. My theory is that Sherman showed up in 1847, and so suddenly there was another weaver in town, and he was putting his name on the coverlet, so D.P. Johnson decided that he better put his name on it. And again, I'm using a male pronoun because they were almost always men, but we don't know in this particular case. All right, so here I tried to figure something out about the D.P. Johnson. So the earliest date, I guess, is 1835 of those that say Orleans County. And then we get down, we see in 1842 there's one identified as Hulberton, 1835 as Eagle Harbor, and then 1847 and 1848 the D.P. Johnson Weaver was added to the inscription. These are all the inscriptions that were on the coverlets. So we can see a little bit sort of the sequence just in terms of the breadth of this collection was enough to tell us a little bit about the story. And I've talked to other people who document coverlets, and the D.P. Johnson appearing on Orleans County coverlets is only in 1847 and 1848, just like this collection shows. This is from my friend Ron Walter, who documents coverlets. Any place he can find them, he keeps track of the names and sometimes the pictures if he possibly can. So there are three coverlets unsigned with a location of Eagle Harbor. There's 36 that he's documented that have Orleans County, New York, range from 1835 to 45. 3 coverlets, Holberton, and 3 coverlets that are signed D.P. Johnson. I think at this point his numbers would be higher than that because there are 2 here, and I know there's several others that we've seen. So who was D.P. Johnson? The bottom line is I don't know. So he's not found there was not a D.P. Johnson found in 1830 census, 1840 census, or the 1850 census. And again, this is the time period that we're looking at on the dates on the coverlets. I found no advertisements for coverlet weaving in any of the Orleans County newspapers. Unfortunately, there aren't too many that have been digitized, which is my main way of accessing them. I did contact the librarian at the library in Albion, and they have some of them on microform that haven't been digitized, and she looked and she couldn't find any advertisements either. There was a David Johnson in Porter in Niagara County, which I believe is just across the border. Is that correct?
No, it's closer to the western part of the county.
Western part of
Niagara County.
Really? It's that far, okay. And it's possible that could be the D.P. Johnson, but at this point it just seems unlikely. There was a David P. Johnson who was a weaver in Cayuga County, and we've got some documentation there, but he died in 1844, so 47 and 48 with D.P. Johnson on the coverlet, that can't be him. And then a researcher years ago was told that D.P. Johnson lived in Cattaraugus County, but at a drop-off point in Orleans County with sample coverlets. I don't know. That's a great story, and it would be a good place to start in research. I haven't been able to find a D.P. Johnson in Cattaraugus County in the censuses as well. In the 1850 census, U.S. Census, was the first year that all the members of a household were listed. Before that, the U.S. Census only listed the head of household and said how many of a different age are in that household. So, since we're looking at 1830s and 40s, I went through and I identified, I have a slide here, I guess, for that. I went through and identified all the Johnsons that were in Orleans County in the 1840 census, and that would be head of household. And then I went and I looked at the 1850 census, because they were listing everybody then who was in the house, to try to see if I could find that there was a D.P. Johnson in one of those households. And I didn't come up with anything. Well, there was one D.P. Johnson in the household of Peter Johnson, but he would have been too young to be weaving in 1847 and 48. So these are some of the things I've been trying to do to try to identify them. So we really don't know who D.P. Johnson is, but if anybody here knows, I'd love to find out. Several of us would like.
Maybe you got gold fever and went to California.
You know, it's quite possible. It's quite possible. I'd like to think that while he was here, there would be something that would, identify him. Yeah, but so far we haven't. All right, so I want to jump into Shearman a little bit here. Didn't realize it was so late. Jay Sherman, as I mentioned, was a weaver in Livingston County, in both Mount Morris and Tuscarora. Tuscarora Village, it says on some of his coverlets, in the 1836 to 1844. We've also identified one in 1846 in Portage, which is before, Portage actually spanned the river at one point, and then when Wyoming County was separated out, Portageville was on the Wyoming County side, so it's right down there at the southern end of Letchworth Park. So there was one there, so he was apparently weaving in those places, Mount Morris, Tuscarora Village, and Portage, from 1836 to 1846. And then we find in 1847 and 1848, very similar coverlets by a guy named J. Shearman, Shearman, in Kendall Mills. I think they're the same people. I just don't know. I haven't been able to put together any more documentation on that. And this is the one here, the Kendall Mills.
Kendall Mills is a divided community. Half of it's in Monroe County, the west half is in Orleans.
Yeah, I was giving Orleans County credit for him. So.
Balkans were Orleans County family.
There was, okay, that's a family name in Balcom. Okay, thank you. So here are two other Shearman Kendall Mills coverlets. Notice these patterns, these two patterns are similar to each other but different from this one. So there are these two patterns, and these patterns actually match one of them that we have from Portage, I think it is. The center field and the border patterns, or at least the border patterns. So the really curious thing about this one is, well, this is fairly typical. It says it was woven by, and it was for S. Webster. This one says, wove by J. Shearman at Kendall Mills, New York for L. M. Pierce of Peru, Mass. So there goes everything I ever said about coverlets that they tended to weave for those right around the neighborhood. Apparently he wove some for somebody pretty far away. So I don't know if somebody locally here ordered it for a family member that was still back in Massachusetts, or
Webster, they had a mill in Kendall Mills. That's who the Kendall Mills was originally named Webster's Mills.
Oh, really?
So
that's an interesting piece of. You make a note of that. So Kendall Mills was originally known as
Webster's Mills. Yeah.
and there's a Webster's Mill, and that's a family name that had been there for a while. Interesting.
You also once discovered that Phelps had another name at one time.
It was Vienna at one point.
Yeah.
Phelps was, yeah.
So when you see that on a coverlet, you know, it's misleading if you didn't know.
Yep. Yep, you have to know a little bit about the local history to put some of these pieces together. And also, in some of the other places, you don't see it too much in the ones we've got here. The AD associated with a date does show up fairly commonly in some of the other coverlets in other regions. So you know this better than I do, but this is a map from 1897, so much later than when they were weaving, but shows where some of the place names, so Eagle Harbor, Hoverton, and Kendall Mills are located in the county. All right, there's one upstairs that has a lion in the corner. The center field, the border, and the lion quarter block patterns are attributed to Almond Tyler, the son of Harry Tyler. So that is probably a Tyler coverlet. So Matilda M. Joy, whose name is on that coverlet, was born in Monroe County but grew up in the town of Yates in Orleans County.
Why did you use that lion?
Pardon me?
What was the purpose of the lion?
Many, if not most of the weavers, their corner block was sort of like their logo. It was their trademark. And he chose the lion. I believe he was born in either England or Scotland, and I think that that came with him. And the story is that his son, Elman, actually talked him out of using the lion, and he switched to an eagle. He said, hey, you're not under the crown anymore. You're here in America. Eagle is the symbol you should be. And some of it, then his later coverlets had eagles in them.
What are these coverlets worth today?
Did you ask a question?
What are the
Yeah.
coverlets worth today?
They range, of course, by condition, by rarity, by what people really like. Most of the coverlets that have lions on it, people are really drawn to for some reason. So there was a auction today, online auction, and there was a Tyler with a different lion corner block, but it was definitely Tyler, and I want to say it went for $800. There was another coverlet in that auction that went a different lot number that I think was like 1,200 or something like that. Those are pretty uncommon these days. I would say average coverlet value these days is more like 200 to 400 range.
So what's the like the lion, something that makes it different, that makes it more valuable?
That's, yeah.
So
And
it's
in an
the-
auction, it takes two people to want it, so, you know,
Yeah.
whatever happens. However bad they want it.
How many hours of work do you think like went into that one there? I mean, you could figure it out about how much they would make an hour or something.
Yeah, a pittance compared to today. It is said that Sarah Lacherette, who was the weaver, professional weaver in Indiana, that she could weave a coverlet in a day. But the biggest time commitment was probably setting up that coverlet to start, the weaver, the loom to start with. So they would set up the loom with enough warp threads to do multiple coverlets. And then they would just, you know, crank through those, before they'd have to rewarp their loom. But it takes a lot of time to set up the loom.
Have you ever found any punch cards?
Yeah, there are punch cards around. We don't have any, but yeah, we've seen them in different collections. Yep. Yeah, they just look like punch cards, and they're usually, you know, like 14 inches by 4 inches or something like that, with rows of punched holes, and then they get stitched together like this, like this, and like this, so that it can sort of feed through the device that is reading those cards. It's not like they're stacked the way, you know, we remember punch cards for computers. They're actually stitched together. I don't think I have a picture here. So Tyler, as I mentioned, he wove primarily in Jefferson County, but here's an advertisement from 1846 where he is weaving in Batavia. The subscriber at his residence half a mile north of the village of Batavia on the Oak Orchard Road is now prepared to do all kinds of coverlet weaving on the best of terms and in a manner not surpassed by anyone. H. Tyler. So this suggests he was living in this area, in Genesee County at least, and we found coverlets that were attributed. He never put his name on any of them, but they've been attributed to him in Genesee County, Orleans County, and Niagara County at the very least. The bulk of them are from Jefferson County or more in that area. So he shifted to an eagle corner block at some point along the way. As I mentioned, that his son, the story is that his son encouraged him to shift from the lion to an eagle, and this is typical. of his lion corner block, I'm sorry, his eagle corner block. But notice this one says Catherine Letts, Orleans County, New York, 1846. And this one's in the Carl Coverlet building. So, who wove coverlets in Orleans County? Well, the geometric coverlets, many of them would have been woven in the home, some of them in the weave shops, and the figured ones. We got D.P. Johnson, we got Jay Sherman, and we got Harry Tyler and or his son. So as far as we know, those are the weavers who were weaving in Orleans County. And there are many unanswered questions yet. So thank you to many people, particularly to Bill Latin for pulling these things out of storage and putting them up where many of us can see them, and Doug for supporting that, and other people who have helped me along the way in my coverlet enthusiasm. Thank you.
Thank you.